very much looking forward. Yes, please feel free to use the chat box where you're living, where you currently reside. These events are always a bit of a one-way street, so it'd be great to have some dialogue as well from other folk. So the idea for today's session is I thought to kind of look at one of the things that people often, one of the things that I get asked about a lot, I guess, people that are interested in poetry, people that are coming to poetry or performance poetry, coming over to the page world. And I mean, it's a huge topic, the idea of difficulty, the idea of strangeness, the idea of tricky writing, what all these things mean, why poets do it, what's the point in making, like a poetry that is obfuscating, that is obtuse, that is oblique, like why do we do it? And there is a method to the madness. And we're going to kind of talk through some of those ideas today, and then try and do some writing off the back of that. I am a big fan of weirdness. I like weird stuff. I like weird stuff because I think I can never be wrong in weird stuff. And with other disciplines, there's always a perceived way of thinking about something. Like you always feel with certain poems, I guess, that are more direct or that are more straight, you kind of look at them and you think, no, there's definitely a way that the poet wants me to think about this. And if you don't feel that you've tapped into that way, you feel you let yourself down. Oh, I'm not clever enough. I'm not smart enough. I don't understand. I haven't got a good command of language. And so I see people a lot of the time, they get quite stressed out. And you get things like, I'm just not clever enough for poetry. Or someone else will say something like, yeah, but it's just too weird. I don't get it. Getting it is really interesting. I think one day I'm going to write a book called Getting It. And I'm just going to literally spend 60,000 words talking about what getting it means. So if my agent is here, there's a pitch, but she's not. So I'll put it to her one day. But yeah, I think I'm really interested in that. And most of this stuff is around logic, like it's around the way of perception, but also the permission you give yourself as a reader. And that's really what I want to kind of look at today, is the way in which we as individuals navigate and sit inside a poem, and then how we come out the other end of that feeling that we've got something. So I'm going to read some poems from After the Formalities. I'll read 2-3 poems, again, quite the weirder poems in the book. And being weird for me was a big thing. It was a huge risk because I came from spoken word, I came from performance poetry, and I was worried that the people that followed me or the people that were into my work from like 2011, 2012 and 2013 weren't going to make this transition onto the page, where I was trying more experimental, kind of more nuanced, more subtle ways of communicating. So I was quite nervous when I was writing After the Formalities because I wasn't sure how it was going to go down. So I'll read some poems from that. We'll have a little chat. We'll look at a poem by Ray Armantrout, who I'm a huge fan of and is one of the kind of avant-garde, maybe like part of the language school poets that it doesn't give you much to go on, but gives you enough to get a sense of what the poem's around. And then we're going to try and write something with our weirdness and see what comes up. So that's the outline. I know there's quite a few people here. I wasn't actually expecting this many people. I thought we'd get like 6 or something like that. So we might not be able to hear from everyone, but if we've got time at the end, 2-3 folk who want to share their work, that would be great as well. But obviously there's like 41 people at the moment, so who knows how many will keep rolling through. So let me read you some poems from this, and then we can get started. So I picked 3 of the weirder ones to see where we go. Hang on, there's one in here that I never actually read, so I might even balls it up, but forgive me, I don't even know what page it's on. Oh yes, page 94. For anyone following along in the text, it's page 94, but I doubt anyone is. This first poem is called Cause. This is on page 16. And to the burning I say my worry is a whole country. I've been myself longer than my undoing. Heavy trunk of silverware, museum glass polish, portraiture of bent flags. I'm here as my grandparents were, only with a moving mouth. During empire, my people were subjects first, citizens later. Once the vigilantes managed to zip up their coats, flames lambent. My grandmother died with umbrellas outstretched in her gut. My grandmother died. To be British is to be everywhere. Some roots have been in the earth for so long, they know only to call themselves earth. A worm's pink nipple bleeds into snow. My birth, my mother's brown skin. I'd already filled half myself with Britannia's air. It took them a month to find my name. So that's that one. Then I'll do this page 90. Actually, I'll do once I had an acceptance speech. That's fun and it's weird. So we can do that one. So this is once I had an acceptance speech. Now, the thing is that if I start telling you all what these poems mean, you create an impression around that. So I'm kind of leaving them open because I think part of the joy is you don't need to preamble. You don't have to preface stuff. Like, people are clever and imaginative to be able to work through the poems as and how they wish. And I think a lot of the time poets do that because they're a bit worried that it's going to sound like a nonsense. And that's, again, part of the evolution, part of the growth of the poet is to trust the reader and to trust the listener or trust the audience and know that whatever happens, they're going to connect with it in some capacity. Like, it's just knowing that and being comfortable in that space. So this is once I had an acceptance speech. Driving too close to the curb, admit to being poor, stash pumpkin seeds for my kid, I hustle the Christian way, starch my shirt collars, value a strong smudge, I give pigeons saintly names, I cream both my feet, recycle, sign off emails with warm regards, double tap hashtag vegan, heart statuses which start with I am delighted to announce mornings. I struggle to decide what mood to wear. Evenings, I lay beside my aftershaves, imagining the sea. I should really have it by now. A Dyson, Panasonic bread maker, a photo by the piano of a slum tour. I need the spirit of a full moon party rather than the charisma of a shed. They honk when I slow. I swear with my eyes, think of real blood. Sunday comes and my dad asks, what's the plan? I knit him the only winning scratch card. I leave a candle on for destiny. Once I had an acceptance speech written. Soon a staircase will rise to defeat us all. The roads have moved. When I get in, I'll sit in the shower and say it's a bath. Double tap an ultrasound pic, sip railroad water, notification, Zank 1 started following you, check my speed, slap on another Barry Manilow playlist, keep my grays in the dashboard, wonder what the guy who put a gun to my little brother's head is doing for New Year's. Wonder if my neighbor made it through. Up ahead, a badger's hit beside a boulder. It's glare, a wooden egg. I slow for. Thanks. That's that one. And I'll do this one isn't too weird. This one is kind of like, this one's just very discursive. This one moves around a lot. And it's called a discursive meditation on the photograph. Another thing, like, it's not fun when you give your poems titles that basically tell the reader what you're going to be doing. It kind of like takes away a little bit of the, you feel like Paul Daniels, you know, like that kind of magician. It's like, yeah, I know how you did that. Like, it's that kind of thing. Nothing wrong with Paul Daniels, by the way. Right, let me read this one and then we'll crack on. Discursive meditation on the photograph. Of image and frame, holding subject matter by its considered light, can you see sentences of angularity, the grammar of buildings, uniformed neon, the emblem of something flying, something falling, middle distance stare. The popinjay moves to occupy more corners, dinky libertine, the sky grows from out your shoulders, garlanded by the matted hair of poverty, set the coffee on the table, roadkill aesthete, rushing to buy a footprint in sand. What is more necessary? The ocean's blue or hope? Panoramic view blinded by light's lack. A matchstick model of a church is balanced on a child's wrist. Pray or play, move around, hold still for me now, dead corpse, so stunning and dead. Bomb blast silent, exploded flash, broken footage, all barren and ruddy. Carnage of apathy, gruesome and exposed and somehow newsworthy, dreaming of porn, dead porn, death porn, murder fatigue. War is a woman trembling and nude, a man boneless. War is a boat with a continent in tow, a grin of bastards, move away from me. Chamomile tea, calm, flower market Sundays, dreamy and bucolic, place it properly, change the lens, make it personal, move around, take another antiseptic song. Blue infirmary, where days are drained by cancer and there's tumours in the water. The nurse's steady lift onto the bed is in memory of closed mortuaries and those further afield. Hold my hand before I die and I love you. Hold my hand as I am born and I love you. A life spent asking for help, asking for love. Do you love me? Do I look good in this body, in this red or this green? Every color is alone. Try taking it from over there. Airbrush the moon's stretch marks. Ask the river to pout. Ask the sea to smile. How many sunsets do we bury in ourselves before we die? And still, my sadness can be nothing but human, flummoxed and looking to forget. Can you see? Can you feel the breath of each brick in this city? We are born to a siren and the wail of each other. I'll drink to that and I'll pray. With dog shit on my shoe and a bladder full of piss, can you see? Everyone gather round my worst side. Asymmetric as rock. This is a honeymoon calling for a rescue boat, a penny balancing on a baby's heart. This is me wanting to look like I've been painted by someone other than myself. Give me direction. Show me God. Keep me still. Push me down. Wash my thoughts before you shoot. Everything is looking for release. Say you look tired. Talk to me about love, the people you remember. Say something different. Say something strange. Talk to me about funerals and the men who stand apart from their wives. Ask me to look up and say, there you are. Can you see? Well, there it is. Hey, that was good. That was like a morning run. Cool. Thank you very much. Thanks very much. So, I think before we kind of look at the poem by Ray Armantrout, I just want to kind of give a little bit of theory, some stuff to think about when going into strange poetry. And I think the more you can go in with a kind of mindset, the easier it is to get on with. And so the first thing is to understand that it's not difficulty for difficulty's sake. That's not what poetry is trying to do. It's not trying to stress you out and make your life difficult. Like, I don't know any poets who, you know, are part of the avant-garde, who are experimental and who sit there and like, I want to really stress the reader out. I don't think it is that. I also don't think it's pretentious. Like, you often see this thing of people saying, oh, you know, it's elitist, it's wanky, it's kind of like self-indulgent and all this kind of stuff that people attach to writing that they don't necessarily connect with. But I don't think it is that. I actually think it's the opposite. The older I get and the more I read work that kind of gives you more to go on or gives you little to go on, the more I actually see it's less egotistical. And the reason why I say that is because this is my logic, right? If you have a poem that is very direct, like it sets out its agenda from the beginning and it tells you how it wants you to think about it. It lays it all out. This is how I want you to think. This is what I want you to feel. And this is what I'm trying to say. If you start having a poetry that does that, what it says to me is that the writer's ego is the dominant thing in the poem. The writer, the poet, is the centerpiece, not you, the reader. They are, because they are directing how you think about this. They're literally pushing you into a place. So when you read a lot of stuff that people say, oh, I get that. For me, when I read those poems, I'm like, I didn't really do much in that poem. Like, the poet did it all. And it's lovely. Like, I'm not saying that you can't enjoy language in that way, but I think it's one of these things where you have to see what is actually going on. The power relation between reader and poet, and the authority that the poet has to steer where they want the poem to go, and what they want the outcome and the intention to be, and ultimately how they want you to think and experience the words. They are in control. Yet the flip to that would be the antithesis would be, is if you have strange writing, the poet disappears. They're not there. You are left completely on your own to navigate that world as and how you wish. There's no direction. You're free falling, like you're literally on your own. And through that, you explore your reading mind. You explore your psychological processes in the way in which things are understood and things are felt. And for me, I love that. I love the feeling of being inside a poem and not knowing where the door is on either side, just being in that world. I didn't enter and I'm not going to leave. I'm just here. I have complete agency now in this poem. Like, they've granted me that. The poet has basically said, I'm not important, you are. Whereas when it's the other way round, I often feel that the poet's ego is at the center, or the poet's experience is at the center. And there's nothing wrong with that per se. It's not like morally wrong. It's not like a bad thing to have those kind of poems. It just means that you are a spectator. You're not really a participant. You're sitting back as an audience member and you're going to give a clap when it's all finished. Whereas if I asked you, what did you actually do in that poem? What was your job in that experience, in that participation? That's a different question. And I think that's where tricky poetry, quote unquote tricky, that's what it wants you to do. It wants you to do the heavy lifting. It wants you to do the working out. And again, there's an art to it, because if you just have a nonsense, people just stop connecting. They're like, this is literally a nonsense. I can't fit in this poem in any way or form. And so they just end up leaving. Whereas a poem that kind of compels you to want to reread it and to revisit it, that is a successful poem. You read it once and you're like, you do the chin scratching. Yes, I wonder, let me go back in again. And then you have another read and you're like, wow, I just keep getting all this stuff from it. That's a successful poem, in my opinion. Those are the ones that I can just keep rereading and rereading. And yeah, like, giving yourself that permission to go in is really, really important. The other thing that I say a lot, and I try and labor this point as much as I can. I did a workshop last week at school, and one of the boys, he said to me, we were looking at this poem. It wasn't a hard poem. They were year nines. It was pretty straightforward, but he was like, oh, this doesn't make any sense. I don't get it. And I said to him, well, what don't you get? Because the whole thing is just like a nonsense. And I said to him, well, all right, let me ask you a question then. Have you ever watched the sunset? You ever watched you stood, out in the countryside, in your garden, and you watched the sunset? And he was like, yeah, I went on holiday with my parents to Thailand and blah, blah. I was like, all right, fine. What did that mean? And he said, what? I said, what did that mean? He goes, what do you mean, what did it mean? And I said, I'm asking, what did the sunset mean? And then he said, I don't know. It was just the sunset. It meant that the day was coming to an end, and it meant that somewhere the sun was going to rise. I'm going, no, I know all that, but I'm asking you, what did it mean? Because I don't understand your question, sir. I said, it's because there's no answer, because it's a non-question. Like, it's not a question. But if I said to you now, how did that sunset make you feel? He'd be like, well, my mum got her camera up and my dad got his video up, and then like he put his arm around my mum, and then this. And I was like, cool. Now you're in the poem. Now you're here. You're here. You're thinking about it with something different rather than this. And so for me, the underlining truth is that you don't have to understand something to experience it. And that's it. That's the kicker. That's what we all go to school for, to be told that you don't have to understand something to experience it. And it's not only getting it intellectually, it's believing that that is also possible, that you can go into a poem, into a piece of abstract art, and know there is something happening here. There is a relationship that you are building with the abstraction, because ultimately life is formless. Everything about our world is formless. It has no shape. The reason why we make art is to create a house for the abstract world. We are looking to try and create structures and patterns for abstractions. And sometimes those abstractions lead to other abstractions in a physical form. I mean, I don't want to get too technical with it, but like, I think that language is very much around patterns and shapes and finding a kind of a way of structuring something quite amorphous. You know, if you think about sexism, you think about misogyny, like they have physical manifestations, but as a concept, how do you shape that? How do you hold that and then present it to somebody? You can only do art. You can only do it through art. Any other way becomes didactic. Any other way becomes instructive. So you have to go through art in order to get to that shapelessness that the thing actually is. And in the way that human beings have built houses to protect themselves from nature, we've built art to protect ourselves from the abstract world, to understand the abstract world. It's the same thing, you know, like you think about it, that's what art is doing. It's creating a house for abstractions. And so you have to go into it with that in mind. And I'm not an essentialist. I'm not a fundamentalist when it comes to poems. I believe in a broad ecumenical church. And I think that is absolutely fine to have different poetries for different situations, for different groups of people. But ultimately, poems have to be pushing language. There has to be a tension. There has to be something elasticated about it. And when it doesn't do that, I feel underwhelmed. I feel that I haven't got anything from this. And that's kind of why I struggle with the Instagram stuff, or the poetry that is quite pedestrian. In that I don't get anything from it. Like, you know, it's that whole thing there. So, you know, that's some stuff to think about. I don't have any questions, by the way. You can put them in the chat box if anyone has anything that they'd like to ask or say, and I can kind of pick up on that. If not, let me get the Ray Armantrout poem up. I looked at this yesterday with my poetry school group, and I put it in the chat box. So hopefully everyone, you should be able to open that, spend 2-3 minutes having a read, and then we can go through it. This is from her new book. It's called Conjure. Yeah, Pinocchio. So, I mean, because there are quite a few of us, I'm not going to open up and do like a complete kind of close reading on this poem. I'll read it out once and then just kind of point at some of the things that this poem is doing particularly well. I think my mouse is done. All right, I'm going to have to use this one. Yeah, this is from her book, Conjure. So, Pinocchio, strand, string, in this dream, the paths cross and cross again. They are spelling a real boy out of repetition. Each one is the one real boy. Each knows he must be wrong about this, but he can't feel how. The fish and the fisherman, the pilot, the princess, the fireman. and the one's on fire. There you go. And what a poem. Like, how fantastic, you know. And again, this is one of these things where what I love about Armand Trout's work is there's never one way to think about her poetry. And that it doesn't want you, it's not a one-way street. Like, it doesn't want you to think about it in one way. What I love about this, why I'm drawn to it, is how she manages to encapture the, I guess, the characteristics of masculinity or masculinities, and draw them out through these kind of like essential, they're not proclamations, they're kind of like, she just points towards the subject. Like, everything, it just seems to point. It doesn't sit you down. It's not abrupt. It's not abrasive. It just kind of like points towards what she's working around. But what I love about it in particular is she works around the essence of language and thought. That's what it is. There's nothing really tangible about the poem. It's bitty, it's fragmented, but it also feels like it works in sections. But then that section is kind of, there's an overarching argument that the poem is making, and how it plays and subverts gender and gender roles, the fish and the fisherman, the pilot and the princess. Now, the lesser poet would have been inclined to want to follow the logic through. The fish and the fisherman, the pilot, the passenger, the fireman, and the ones on fire. But she's smart, so she gives you the princess to work around, to really highlight that gender discrepancy that she's playing around. And it's the only time really where we see a gendered, someone who is a female, come into the frame to contrast, juxtapose this idea of the real boy. But then she uses very interesting words. He can't feel how. So again, you're looking at tradition. You're looking at the way that gender is performed. You're looking at the way that gender is inherited, and that masculinities are ultimately plural. And she's basically giving you a dissertation on gender roles and masculinity and inherited behavioral patterns through, you know, what is this, 12 lines, whatever it might be. But I mean, we spent an hour yesterday in my group talking about this poem, and it was going off in so many different interesting directions that if the poem was literally about masculinity in a way that didn't really have much of an avenue to explore the different elements of that, it probably wouldn't be as interesting. And she's called it Pinocchio. It's a fallacy. It's a lie. There's a myth towards it, you know, like, you are lying. And you're also a wooden puppet being controlled by what? By tradition, by the behavior that you inherit or how you perceive yourself to be in a social context. So all that, this is what I get from it. And look how bitty the whole poem is. Now, what's interesting with Armand Trout is how she uses breath. You can control your reader's breathing by the way in which you use lineation, by the enjambment, by the space between the clauses. Because she's got clauses that are essentially running over into each other, but she disrupts those clauses through the use of space, which is a super clever and a really difficult thing to get right, because you can jar the reader to the point where they have enough. I can't be bothered with this. This is all over the place. But she does it in a way that feels almost like a stone just kind of moving through water. Like, it has that feel to it. And all her poems do this. I mean, you read a book and it's tiring. Like, it is, she puts you through your paces, because every poem is like this for a long time. And, you know, you get to a point where you're just like, all right, cool. Cheers. I get it now. But it just constantly keeps going. When I first came across her years ago, I didn't know how to think about her poems. I struggled with it. And it was one of these things that I struggled with. And I didn't like the fact that I struggled with it. I felt that there was something in the language that wanted me to do some work. And I just didn't know how to do that work. And when I read her now, I literally, at the top of each one of her poems, I write 2-3 things of what I think she's working around. So for this one, masculinities, gender, and age. Those are the things that I was working around. Like, that's it. And then I'll just move on. And for me, I've got enough from the poem that I'm I'm comfortable in that. Like, I feel I connected with it. And yeah, and they all do that. Her use of, look at the commas as well. Her comma use is really interesting. What the commas do in this context. To start off with strand and string is fine because she's given you Pinocchio. So you kind of have a context to think about those things in. The question I asked my group yesterday was, do you think she wrote this poem with the title first, or did the title come after? And that's another really interesting thing, you know, like depending on how people write, I never know what I'm doing in my poems. I work it out as I go along. I usually just start with a line that I think is interesting. And by interesting, I mean, I don't know what this line means. I can't trace it or pin it to anything. It just is an interesting line that I can interrogate. And then I just follow that through. And then slowly, after days, weeks, months, the poem starts to materialize. And when you listen to Terence Hayes, Jericho Brown, Carl Phillips, like all these poets talk about, I mean, I don't know about Sharon Olds. I listen to a lot of Sharon Olds interviews. I think she's so fascinating. And she's one of the old guard who just constantly feel relevant. Like, she's a poet who I feel is reading contemporary poetry, who's reading younger poets and is engaged with what younger poets are doing. And listening to her interview, she talks a lot about having a thing, trauma. How do you explore trauma? Are you going to ride that anecdotally? So the anecdote is an interesting move. And a lot of her poems are kind of anecdotal in that they feel biographical. They're about her, but you get swept into it. Whereas this one doesn't feel like it's about Ray Armantrout. Ray Armantrout is an 80-year-old lady from America who is writing poems about masculinity and also about becoming a grandmother with twins. So that's kind of like the ultimate, ambition of the book. But then you still feel that you're able to participate in that. Is it imagistic? It's not. There's not a lot of imagery in this poem. Like, it's kind of just very subtle, almost like bullet points that just kind of, like I say, point and push towards a particular argument or ambition. Did anyone not like this? You can put in the chat box if you didn't really like it. That's really interesting about the twins, because I got DNA and cloning from the poem. Yeah, right. Okay, cool. Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's what Conjure, her whole thing is about, having twin boys. So that's why there's a lot of masculinity poems. Two people yesterday in my group said they thought it was bigger than masculinity. They said that we're focusing on masculinities, but they felt the poem had a bigger remit, like it was talking into gender as a whole, and it actually was a lot more inclusive of women than what we would kind of, I mean, there was 15 of us in the group and everyone was quite fixated on it being quite androcentric, but she was like, actually, yeah. Jana says, maybe I was drawing from the conversation we had about language. I was thinking about the way that language creates you as a person. Yeah, for sure. You build a sense of self. Like, I think I spoke about it once and I said, like, these kind of poems invite you in and ask you to invent a way to think about them. They want you as a reader, as a private reader, to invent a way to think about them. Yeah, it has all of those. It has all of those elements to it. I wonder what that means in terms of the ideal way for poetry to be experienced. Is the page better, so it doesn't impose a voice and interpretation? If not, how do you read to not impose one interpretation on the audience? Well, again, I think this is the distinction between modes, right? And this is why I kind of think sometimes it's a little bit unfair on spoken word, because they're always being compared, spoken word versus the page, and they have different agendas. The spoken word agenda is not the agenda of the page poem. Like, they have different things. The problem is because they're attached to class, we stratify them, and we see one as being more urbane and sophisticated and kind of attributed to the intellectual class. And then we see the other being more performative, being more theatrical. And obviously in this culture, in Western culture, we value the written word over the spoken word. because the written word has always been something that you attribute to the bourgeoisie, white collar jobs, all that kind of stuff. Whereas the oral tradition is something that is older. You need less to be able to do it. I personally don't get into those discussions. I think both serve a purpose. I think both are equally as important to poetry and to the art and to the performing arts and the linguistic arts. And I think how you experience a poem isn't a binary. It's not a this or that. It's multifaceted. When I read a poem on a page, I'm not just reading it, I'm feeling those words, and then I can have a choice. I'm going to read that poem out. I'm really interested in that image. Now I can't stop thinking about that image, and I can't stop hearing that sound. So there's so many different things that happen. It's a multi-dimensional experience. In the same way, when you go and watch a performance poet, it's the same thing. Difference is they are in control. You are passive. You're sitting back as an audience member in a dark theatre, and you're engrossed in this. But ultimately, what both things want to do is transcend. That's what we're paid. That's what we buy our tickets for. We want transcendence. We want to see the poet, the art, the argument, the philosophy, the intellect transcend, leave where it begins. It starts at its object, it starts at its preoccupation, and then it lifts off. It has to. If the poem doesn't, it fails. You haven't gone anywhere. You've walked around the block. You need the poem to leave, which is why when I'm lecturing, I often say to younger poets, your poem needs to look up. Like, it has to look up. It's navel gazing. It's looking at itself. It's obsessed with itself. And me as a reader, I'm not here. I'm watching you be obsessed with yourself. Where do I fit in this? Someone who will never meet you, who isn't that invested in your life and your well-being, a complete stranger. How do I fit in this? And we forget that it's a dialogue. So I think these are things to remember, and how you get that shift, how you get that push at the end. I don't know. I've never really read anyone, and I've read a lot of literary criticism. I've read a lot of poetry criticism. I've written poetry, and I've never found an answer that works. I think it's just the divine. That's it. I put it down to that. I mean, it's weird and it's hippie. I'm not I'm not a religious person, but there is something in that in the old days, they would have put it down to God, or that idea of transcendence, the sublime. But I think that's what it is. It leaves. It's ineffable, like it goes somewhere, and you go with that somewhere else too. But again, don't put too much on the ending. I think we focus a lot on endings, like, again, spoken word, it's all about the ending. It's all about, where are we going with this? I've sat here, I've listened to this guy go on for 3.5 minutes now, and you better take me somewhere. It's that, because you, as an audience, you're invested, whereas on a page, you don't have to do that. You don't have to. In fact, the most interesting poems are unresolved. When they asked Ray Armantrout about difficulty and readability, her answer was, how readable is the world? The world is not readable, and the world is not organized. The world is not logical, and the world is not symmetrical. So to have a poetry that is logical, conclusive, and symmetrical is not a true reflection of the origins of that poem, where it came from, what it was born out of. And so that's what disruption and formlessness is really, really important. There's a great book by Carl Phillips called The Art of Daring. I recommend everyone read it. He just talks a lot about, it's about risk, imagination, and daring. And he talks a lot about the things that we've talked about today. The other one is Wayne Kostenbaum, who's the other guy who I really, really love, who talks, what does it all mean? So he writes a lot on difficulty and the purpose of difficulty. So yes, that's what it is. Let's do some writing. I want to see what we can come up with in this short time that we have together. So I'm going to keep the instruction pretty broad. In other words, you can write about what you want, like pick your theme. But I want us to try and follow a Ray Armantrout-ish logic, in that what we do is we try and focus on clauses. So we write in clauses. And by that, I mean kind of like arguments within the poem, like strong. That's not like bullet points. We're not talking punchlines and stuff like this. We're just talking solid clauses. So you don't have superfluous language. Watch your adjectives all the time. Your adjectives will weigh your poem down. You don't need them in poems. You don't need conjunctions either. Conjunctions are stylized. If you're going to have an and, it has to be thought out. You don't need because, you don't need as, you don't need any of these words. This is a hangover from prose. In poems, the reader knows that this is tied to that. In a simile, you don't even need the word like or as. This is textbook stuff they teach you at school. And then when you take the stabilizers off, you're like, oh yeah, the sentence still works even without the, the connective. So play around with that. But one thing that I will ask is that we all keep each line to 3 words. You cannot exceed 3 words on each line. So after your 3rd word, you line break to see what you can come up with. And that economy, forcing you into that straitjacket, is going to really push your thinking, because you can't exceed that. Which is why anyone who feels that they are an excessive writer, who kind of overwrites and can go off on tangents and whatever else, practice with sonnets. Sonnets are an amazing way to craft and to hone control, because you cannot go further than 14 lines. And if you want to be true, work to the iambic pentameter. Each line, 10 syllables. Literally, like, it's great training. It's like when you're exercising and it's building up that understanding of how to use and utilize the space on the page. In the Ray Armantrout poem, those spaces, that white space, is doing as much work as her lines are. We are reading those and we are responding to the white space. So don't see the white space as a non-entity. See it as language. See it as something that is being communicated as well. And there's a reason why the poet lays the poem out in this particular way. Try not to be too on the nose. Concrete poems, you run the risk of being too obvious. I was working with a guy the other day, and he had a poem as a cup, and it was about a cup, but he literally shaped it as a cup. And I was like, dude, nah, man, come on. Like, it's fine. Like, you can lose the cup. We know it's about the cup. And I think, it took him weeks and weeks to get the cup, but I just kind of said, you don't need to go to those lengths. It's much better to invest that energy into the lines rather than, the shape. So yeah, subject as you wish, 3 lines, 3 words, per line, and see how we go. We're gonna have 15 to 20 minutes. So 1:05, we'll reconvene and see how you get on. So don't overthink this. Like, don't sit there thinking, oh, where do I start? If you don't know where to start, take a book. I've got Louis McNeice here, and then just open up, and whatever line he's working with, in the porch of the chapel before the garish virgin. There you go. You start there. You put that down, and away you go. And then what you do is, when you finish your poem, cut the line, and whatever happens from underneath that is yours. But you obviously don't want to get done for plagiarism, so you lose that line and then you go. But that's if you don't know where to start. If you're like me and you work on notebooks, I've got like 4 or 5 notebooks around me. I open up one of those books. I usually have some weirdo line in there. I throw that in the poem and away we go. So however you wish to start, go ahead. And yeah, 5:05, or maybe a bit after 5:05, because I've waffled on for an extra minute here. But yeah, cool. Let me know. I'm going to be here. So if anyone gets stuck, just throw a little message in the chat box and we'll pick it up. Okay, welcome back. How was that? I always like looking at people's faces when they've just been 20 minutes deep in the zones. Yeah, great. Yeah, how was it? How did you find it? Lydia says that was great. Playful. Some weird stuff came out. Good. Weird is good. Kath has got thumbs up. Got somewhere in the end. Really fun. Yeah. I mean, literally, for people who, I guess, who kind of want to increase their productivity or their relationship to poems, it's just setting yourself ways of writing. It's like gearing yourself up and just doing different kind of things that will enable the writing. And if that means working around the particular meter, doing things, removing conjunctions, like write a poem that is just nouns. Like I've got a whole load of things on my notepad, or like write one poem without a comma, just like one long sentence that just keeps going and going and going and going. And the thing is, like, you don't doesn't mean you're going to end there. It's just a way for you to get going. And I think that's what most people struggle with, is this idea of inspiration and the muse. I don't believe in any of that stuff. I don't even believe in writer's block. Like, I literally, none of that stuff I think is true. I think we put psychological barriers up that prevent us from going forward. But really, it's just about giving yourself an exercise, workshopping yourself and saying, like, go into the dictionary and open up at the letter F and go 13 words down, begin your poem on that word. Just things like that. I mean, it's completely bonkers, but it's a way of getting going. And then once you get going, that's it. You're in, like, and then it becomes fun and interesting. And then it's a different way of thinking, because now you've got to think as an editor. You need to think as somebody who, moves around more. Adverbs and adjectives have sticky bonds. They do. It's the thing that I think it's the most common, not mistake, but it's the most common thing that people make in poems is adjectives, because they think that by describing something, you are poeticizing that thing. You're creating a poetry, but really what you're doing is you're decorating. It's ornamentation. The adjective doesn't do anything apart from say to the reader, it's a red phone box, or like push the association by saying, it's a blue phone box. And then the reader's like, what does blue signify? And it's just that, and it can be doing so much more. The other thing on top of the adjective kind of heavy poem is non-specificity. Now, this is really, really interesting, because this is something that I realized, maybe 2-3 years ago, and I used to do it quite a lot. When I started writing After the Formalities, I used to have a lot of somewhere and someone in the poems. Someone somewhere is crying, somewhere a mother bleeds, somewhere a father, and it's just like, where, tell me where. Like, it's more interesting to tell me where, because essentially what you do is it's a missed opportunity for detail. Like, having a specific detail in that abstraction solidifies the poem. It concretizes the poem. And that's really what you want to be careful of, is how you balance the specificity with the non-specificity. And I think you can balance it. It doesn't mean that you've got to go one or the other way. It just means that when you're moving through the poem, you give the reader enough, and then you pull back a little bit. Then you give them a bit more, and then you pull back. So it's literally that kind of balancing act that will keep the thing interesting. But yeah, there's a lot of somewheres in poems. Now, what's interesting is Danez Smith has a very famous poem, Summer Somewhere. And I use that as an example of, we know where the somewhere is. That's why it works, because the somewhere is the alternative paradise that they have reimagined for Black boys who've been killed by police and racists, which are mostly the same thing. So it's that kind of thinking where you know where the somewhere is. And that's what I find really fascinating, is it if you use a non-specific word, nondescript, use it, but then also like point it somewhere at the same time. So it's not just like, you know, out in the middle of nowhere on its own. That's when I feel it's like a missed opportunity. I like words like it as well. I can see it, I just can't feel it. It's like, what's it? Like when you begin a poem with it, there's too much like not knowing. So my advice to folk is to always begin in a place of certainty, or to try and concretize the beginning of a poem. Then you can move out into the weird and the wonderful further down the line. But you need to situate the reader first. You need to put them in something. The Ray Armantrout poem, she sets you up from the title. From the title, you kind of know what's going on, and then she's free to take you out. Whereas if you go in on an ambiguity and you stay in that space, you know, it's almost like trying to climb up a mountain that's made of butter and you're in a very hot country. Like, it's not going to happen. That's kind of what it feels like sometimes. So I often tell folk, concretize the beginning, then get nuts as you go on. You know, a poet who I think is really pushing stuff in the UK is Holly Pester. If you get a chance to read Comic Timing on Granta, I really recommend it, and I love it. But a lot of folk that I've spoken to about it have said I don't get it, like it's too out there. But I don't know if there is such a thing as too out there. I just think we close down with certain poetries. What about having sometimes in poems? Yeah, sometimes as well. It's like, what time? You know, and it's you can have them, but there needs to be enough of a context for them to work as a detail, if that makes sense. Like, you can't just plonk them in, because then it's where, like, and as a reader, nothing happens to you. Your mind isn't really engaging with that idea, with that line. It just kind of, you know, it just carries on reading, because it's a non-entity, it's a non-event. Jackie said, how about using the title as the concrete, then go straight into the abstract? Yeah, you can do that, which I think is what Ray Armantrout's kind of doing. So yeah, you could do that. But again, I always get a little bit underwhelmed by poems that are trying to like explain themselves from the title. You know, like that's another thing, like a poem that feels that it needs to kind of summarize. This is a poem, like, you know, this is a poem about grief, and the poem is just called Grief. And then, you know, it's that. And I'm just like, well, come on, man, like you can be a little bit more daring. So there is different ways that you can go around it. And another exercise before we get into some reading, but another thing that I often do is I have one of these little mini things, these little notepads, and when I have a spare, I don't know, half an hour or so, I usually just make like lists of nouns, right? I just go through and I just write, there was a bus there, lamppost, brick, whatever. And then I hyphenate. I just do an association exercise and I keep it in my notebook. So from a brick, I will have house, and from a house, I have protection, and from protection, I have the state. And I will just do that. And then what you can do is you've literally got 3 kind of tiers of association. So when it comes to wanting to have material or build up the interiority of a poem, you go into that little notebook, you've got you've got a database of words and things that are just sitting there waiting to be used. So it's really, really handy to do that kind of stuff. And also when you're reading poems, if there's a word or a noun or a thing, like, you know, like I was reading Lost Alphabet by Lisa Olstein, and like this is about I don't know why I've signed up to try and say that word, but it's someone who specializes in moths and butterflies, however you say it. I looked it up online, but I've forgotten how you say it. And she's got loads of really interesting nouns in here that I just stole, basically. I just put them in my notebook and I'm going to repurpose them in some way at some point. So you can do that, you know, stuff that's interesting, stuff that's, you know, you don't really come across each day. keep a notebook and keep everything on record, and then open it up when you need to write. And you want to try and create, it's what Jack Underwood calls a lateral shift. And I love that way of thinking about the lateral shift of a poem. As it's going down, it just goes, it shoots off that way, and then it comes back in. So these kind of words give it an expanse, like a sense of width that you want. But you don't want a poem to feel too narrow. You want it to feel, what was the last collection called? Oh yes, the last collection was called Lost Alphabet. Lisa Olstein is one of my favorite poets. I've got all 3 of her collections. I learned so much. She works a lot in prose poetry. Like before, prose poetry was really like the point of contention, where everyone arguing, is there such a thing? She was just doing it in like 2002. Well, I guess Anne Carson was doing it a little bit before that. But is that you spell it? Stein? Yeah, that's how you spell it. Yeah. Cool. Let's. Who would like to share? If you put your name in the box, we'll run it for 15. So Julia's going to go first, and then Alan, Carson. Let's get one more in there. Who's the brave soul? Debbie, and then Verity. All right, cool. We'll cut there and we'll see how we go. So, Julia, you may unmute and commence proceedings. Julia, you got stage fright? Oh, there she is.
No, sorry. I put it in the chat as well. Right. Jumbled carpet patterns, stalks, leaves, broken glass, red breaths circling rooms. Home shrine plays Beatles records, twisting on the radiogram, warped from too much sun. Phantoms appear every night.
Yeah, that's great. That's that last line, right? Because there is so much like detail to that world, like the records of this and that, and then it's phantoms. That's where it just shoots off, because phantoms and they appear at night. Really great. Just watch. The only thing that I would say is like, don't make it too bitty. Like you can use conjunctions to glue in clauses, or find other ways to do it. And I know we said forget conjunctions, but if you get rid of them altogether, or you kind of lose any kind of glue, the clauses just don't really feel that they relate to each other. So you want to try and create that, or it just ends up becoming too non sequitur, which some people really like and others aren't into. I love non sequitur poetry. But yeah, you can definitely fit in a few little glue things there. So that's great. Thank you very much. Thanks, Julia. Alan.
Off mute. Brilliant. Okay. Went out gardening, tripped over corpse, my imaginary friend. Hadn't spoken recently. Who do I notify?
That's great. Yeah, very good. Fantastic. That's an amazing. There's something about that opening line. I went gardening and tripped over a corpse. Like, it's just, yeah, it's that kind of setup. Where do you go from that? And I think that's what makes a really interesting experiment, is the weirder the setup, I feel, the more possibility you create, because it's so impossible. So you can essentially go anywhere, like, whereas the more possible a setup is, you're limited to where you can actually go. So if you're looking for impossibility and the kind of infinite in a poem, make it as weird as possible. Like, that's a great example. I went out gardening and I tripped over a corpse. It's just like, that's it. Then you carry on going. Really, really good. And ending it with a question, who do I notify, is also very interesting, because you implicate the reader. The reader then takes that poem with them and is now doing the lifting. They're like, yeah, who does he notify? Like, it is that. And it's like, you start to think about that whole thing again from a very personal kind of perspective. So yeah, really good. Who is it who uses, there's someone who uses questions really well. Will Harris. You read Will, and I'm plugging Grant here, but you read Will Harris, Rendang, and that collection, there's so many questions, but he writes it in a way where you don't realize they're questions, but it's a very searching book. So here's the thing. When you sit down to write, you can either do two things. You can either write because you feel you have something to say, or you write because there's something that you're trying to discover. Those are your options. That's literally the only way that people write. There's something I want to work out, or there's something that I just want to say. Now, sometimes you do both, right? You can do both too. But I often feel writing from a place of discovery has so much more scope, because writing from a place of knowing means you're limited because you know where you're trying to end up. You write from questions. I have questions about the world. I have questions about the people in the world. That broadens the scope and the kind of remit of the poem. Thanks, Alan. Thanks for sharing that. Carson.
Hi. All right, let me just get it on screen. Wherever it's gone. In the streets, a mother holds her son like a question, blood thickening into puppy fats, the car abandoned on the train tracks, an island on fire. The next day, the TV says burned out, implying the violence came from within. What is a mother if not a bomb shelter? What is a country but a clenched fist holding water?
Oh, geez. That's fantastic. Did you just write that?
Yeah.
Jesus, that's fantastic. Yeah. That got me, man. Like, that was amazing. Yeah, well done. I don't know what to say apart from well done again. Wow. I guess the only thing, and this is nitpicking because it's so brilliant and I feel like I have to say something because it's my job, is the clenched fist. That's the only thing I'd probably lose because it's known. So you could have like a clenched leaf, a clenched river, like something to set up the last line of water, but move out of the fist, because we know that fists are clenched. And it's also a trope in poetry, like loads of, like, everyone just associates fists with violence. And so I do it myself. So I often feel that once you know that it's easy, like it's low hanging fruit, go somewhere else. And it just means like you just got to be really critical of the work, and wherever you feel you're working in kind of like familiar terrain, just move out of that and go into something weird. Mary Ruefle is amazing for that. When I want to get really like, left field, I just read a Mary Ruefle poem and then I'm out there again, like I'm out in the wilderness. So she's really great for that. That was amazing. Thanks, Carson. Debbie.
I don't actually know how to follow that. Sense, and I have to apologise because I stole a title from your book, and I didn't. Makes no sense, but I'll go for it because I'm usually too shy. So,
right.
Sympathy for rain, the clock ticks, wooden worktop shame, reborn innocence gone, never better, never worse. 1,000 voices beg, drowning in blood. One more time. That was about addiction, I think. I don't really know.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, it's the one more time, right? And it's like, it's such a capitulation. Like when you close a poem with that kind of idea, like just one last time, it really is quite tragic, like, to hear that. And I know that people that do write about addiction, there's a lot of repetition in the work, like, or in the clauses. There's a lot of that. I love the blood analogy as well, like the setup with the blood. Yeah, that was great. There was one thing I thought that you could probably push more at the beginning. I can't remember what it was now. I should have written it down. But yeah, the one more time is, yeah, really, really powerful. And And also, like, you don't have to know what it's about. Like, it's fine. Like, you know, like the idea of like having to identify the poem. It's like, sometimes you realize what the poem wants. Sometimes you're trying to do something with the poem and the poem just wants to do something else. Like, it happens all the time. Like, you go in there with an agenda, with an idea, with a kind of ambition, and 2 weeks later, you're over here now. I started a Sistina in October and I'm at the envoy now. Like, and it's literally taken me this long to get to the envoy. And before that, I was literally trying to think, what am I even doing here? Like, I don't really know what this poem is trying to do or what I'm trying to get out of it. And you just got to stay with it and keep chipping and keep chipping. I mean, I do it slightly because of the fact that I feel that if I don't, the poem's won. And so I'm in this weird like tension with it. But yeah, that was great. That was really, really brilliant. Thanks, Debbie. And lastly, who do you have? Verity, right? Was it Verity? Yeah, Verity Williams.
Hi, yeah.
Hi.
Okay, sorry, I'm nervous. So yeah, this is a bit of a weird one. Doesn't really make a lot of sense. But I I called it manners. Son sits at head of table, sister on left. The portrait, father eating mother's ashes, the cake knife. I'm King Baboon. Look how large, red and potent my bum is. Sister opens her arm with the cake knife, points to the moon. Son is building Icarus wings with a ham in his sandwich. Sister points her arm, rubied slick, dribbles bitter black coagulate. I am son that will fly to the sun with my ham wings and my red bum. Sister amputates her arm, slaps son and throws him to the sea, watches son's red bum, son's ham wings sink. Father still eats mother's ashes, sister watches and bleeds out for a millennia.
Jeez. Yeah, that's crazy. That's really great. It's so clinical. It's such a clinical poem. Like, it feels so cold and indifferent. And because you haven't got those conjunctions, there's nothing warm. It's like a report. It's like, because they're all imperatives and they're literally directives or imperatives, there's nothing in that says there's no vulnerability. Although, like, it's so, like, the kind of the camera work and the cinematography of the poem is so lucid and metaphorically loaded. You don't connect with any of the sister. You know, it's using the article. It's not mine. It's not yours. It's the sister. The ashes. Then Icarus, the water, bleeding out for millennia. I wonder if you just left it on bleeding out, full stop, and lost millennia. That feels that it just goes on. Like, again, using those kind of, so the word, ask Debbie, I remember now, it's the word thousand. So the word thousand, millennia, those big details, you're better off losing them and just like letting it ring, like just letting it sit out and not have those because again, they're just too big. And all you're trying to say is for a very long time. That's really what you're getting at. So if you lose that and just have out, bleeding out, that's shattering. Like, to close a poem on bleeding out, yeah, that's a lot. Fantastic. That was brilliant. Thank you, Verity. Thank you very much. I could talk about these more, but I'm conscious of time. Cool. Thank you, everyone, for coming along today and participating and listening and discussing. Yeah, it was amazing. I've had great fun. I have to jump in a car and go to a secondary school now, so I doubt I'm going to have that much fun there. We're going to do a Simon Armitage poem, so see how we get on. But yeah, thank you so much. It's been great. Wish you the best with your writing and stuff, and hopefully see you all down the road at some point. Cool. I'm going to say goodnight and goodbye, and thank you very much. See ya.